So, if you've ever been online and talked about miracles or Jesus and given evidence for the resurrection, you've probably heard atheists make the comparison between certain miracles associated with Jesus and the flying horse of Muhammad. So, in this video, we're going to compare them and look at them. But first, let's see a few atheists who make this claim. Here's Richard Dawkins making the claim. Here is Sam Harris making the claim. Here is a meme making the claim. Here are two more memes.
Wait, Islam was the right religion?
Right.
But Muhammad was supposed to have flown to heaven on a flying horse. How was I supposed to believe that?
Oh, but you believed Jesus flew to heaven using nothing at all?
Here is a tweet making the claim. Here is a quote from a book attacking Christianity, making the claim. And here is yet another meme making the claim. For example, this one specifically relates to the topic of this video, so I'll look at it. It talks about how Muslims believe in it because of the Quran. By the way, the story that is mentioned here does actually not come from the Quran. It comes from the hadith. And we're going to talk about what the Quran says about the night journey in a little bit. And then the second one mentions witnesses, and we're also going to talk about that. So let's first start off with talking about the night journey. What does the Quran actually say about the night journey? Here is pretty much the extent of what the Quran says. There is a few other verses that you could point to, but you wouldn't really know that those refer to the night journey, except for the later sources. So let's actually see what the Quran says. So the verse reads, "Glory to Allah, who did take his servant for a journey by night from the sacred mosque to the furthest mosque, whose precepts we did bless, in order that we might show him some of our signs, for he is the one who heareth and seeth all things." First of all, the thing to notice about this verse is what it doesn't mention. It says that he went on a journey. It doesn't say how he went on the journey, what actually took him there. It says that he was shown the signs of Allah, but it doesn't mention anything about traveling to heaven or anything like that. And it doesn't mention, it also says the furthest mosque, but doesn't say where this mosque is. It's only in much later sources that we find out that it is actually Jerusalem. And we're going to investigate that a little bit as well. So let's look at where Muslims are actually getting this source, because, you might wonder, if these details are not in the Quran, where are Muslims getting the story? Well, they're getting it from here. Sahih al-Bukhari. Sahih al-Bukhari says, "Then the white animal, which was smaller than a mule and bigger than a donkey, was brought to me. On this, Al-Juward asked, 'Was it the Buraq?' O Abu Hamza, I, i.e. Anas, replied in the affirmative. The Prophet said, 'The animal's step was so wide that it reached the furthest point within reach of the animal's sight. I was carried on it, and Gabriel set out with me till we reached the nearest heaven.'" And so this is where Muslims are actually getting the story. If you read the entire hadith, it goes into very great detail about him traveling to heaven, the conversation he had with Moses about the number of prayers, and stuff like that. And it's interesting how you have so little detail in the Quran, and so much detail in the hadith. So as you can see from this description, it describes the animal as a creature that was white, smaller than a mule, and bigger than a donkey. But you see, when most people, especially atheists, think of the flying horse, and we even saw this in some of the memes, they think of it as looking like this. But in actuality, Muslim sources describe it more as something like this. Some of the details are not always there. For example, not all the sources describe the animal with wings. Not all of them describe it with the tail of a peacock. But, almost all the depictions I've seen of it do describe it as having the head of a woman. And they do describe it as you could say a horse-like animal, but I guess it would be closer to a mule or a donkey. And they also describe it as being white and able to fly. So all those descriptions are pretty much solid, although the wings and the tail of a peacock are sometimes there, sometimes not there. So, One of the implications of the five out of the 9 memes, quotes, and videos we looked at is that Christians will dismiss the claim of Muhammad flying to heaven on Buraq due to its ridiculousness. And one of them, that would be the dark matter clip, even suggests that Christians will reject Islam because of this. Now, this is a rather odd claim for several reasons. First of all, I know about many of the Christians who deal with Islam regularly and who confront it regularly, provide arguments against it. People like Nabil Qureshi, David Wood, Sam Shamoun, Anthony Rogers, and Jay Smith. And not once have they argued that due to its ridiculousness, the story of the night journey cannot be true. But they have made arguments against it, and we're going to look at some of those. But first, another thing that's ridiculous about the claim is that Christians will reject Islam because of it. Now, to show you that this claim is simply not true, in the description box, I will include a video link to 50 reasons why, a video made by David Wood and Sam Shamoun, 50 reasons why they reject Islam. I'll provide a shorter version and a longer version. The shorter version will be 5 minutes, and the longer version will be 5 hours. And just to show you that of the top 50 reasons why they reject Islam as being true, not one of them has anything to do with the night journey. But there's another problem with this claim, with the investigation of miracles, is that atheists assume that miracles are by their very nature ridiculous, and that they assume that other people will agree with them. But in David Wood's video, where he talks about, did Muhammad perform miracles, he makes a very good point in the beginning of that video.
So this is to show that Muhammad is in the same line with all of these guys. And if Muhammad did perform miracles, that would be something that we would need to consider as evidence for Islam.
And so, the ultimate point is that if Muhammad did perform miracles, that would be evidence for Islam. I mean, of course, depending upon the miracle, we'd have to investigate it. And we will investigate critically why Christian apologists have rejected the night journey. But we have to describe why it is rejected. So the primary implication, of course, is that both of these events are equally as improbable. So we are going to investigate the claim, first by looking at what Christian apologists say, then, going into more detail on some of those.
Here is what the Dome of the Rock looks like inside. All of the outer part have been rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt 11 times. 1876, finally, you get that outer structure that we have today. But the only original part are those 2 inner ambulatories that you see there pictured at the very center of the building. Now, when you look at those ambulatories, you need to look at the inscriptions, which are part of the original structure. Those inscriptions are in Arabic on the outer ambulatory, on the upper dome, and on the inner ambulatory. Those green arrows are pointing to where those inscriptions are today. You can read them. They're in Arabic, and look and see what they say. They say nothing about the Miraj. What do they say? Well, you have Surah 4, Ayah 171. Go ahead and read what they say.
They're just refuting Christianity, basically.
And then, of course, you have Sam Shamoun saying on Answering Islam, he says, "The problem with this is that the first Jerusalem temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian armies in 587 BC. Furthermore, General Titus and his Roman soldiers leveled the second temple in AD 70, more than 5 centuries before this alleged night journey to Jerusalem took place. In fact, the temple that eventually became the furthest mosque did not come into existence until AD 691, when Amr Abu al-Malik built it." And finally, we're going to look at what David Wood has to say, and we're going to expand on some of what he says.
This is supposedly an example of a miracle. Now, the problem, of course, right off the bat, is that Aisha herself, in Ibn Ishaq and other sources, was asked about Muhammad's night journey, and she said he was in bed the entire time. So this is not Muhammad miraculously being taken away and him disappearing from Mecca and being taken to Jerusalem and so on. This is Muhammad getting some sort of vision, right? Some sort of vision.
Correct. And if I may add also, Dr. Wood, a miracle is intended for others to see it. So his own wife said he was asleep. But even let's assume he left the room. Nobody saw this.
Yeah.
No one said, I saw something unusual, Buraq. I saw the prophet fly in somehow.
Yeah.
I saw an angel. I heard voices. None of that.
It makes no sense for someone to say, hey, I was taken on a journey. No one saw it, but I was, trust me on this one, I was taken on a journey. So best case scenario, you could say, well, the Quran says it, but no one sees it. And so
Right.
it's basically Muhammad saying that he went on a journey. And, oh, by the way, it's just some sort of vision. So this would be like me saying, hey, I had a dream or something like this.
So, as you could see, David Wood showed how this was viewed by the earliest Muslims as a type of dream or vision, or something that happened while Muhammad's body was asleep. And this is actually confirmed. I mean, he didn't quote specifically from Ibn Ishaq, but I'm going to quote from it here. This is a direct quote. This is talking from Aisha. And it says, one of Abu Bakr's family told me that Aisha, the Prophet's wife, used to say, the apostle's body remained where it was, but God removed his spirit by night. And this is actually the earliest detailed source we have on the night journey. There's no earlier source we have that really goes into the kind of detail that we want when talking about what the miracle, what exactly happened. And so this is pretty much what we have. And even this was written about 140 years after Muhammad died. So it's interesting that even a source so late still says that it wasn't really a miracle. So let's actually put all this together for the Islamic claim. So let's look at all our sources. So in the Quran, even if we accept the traditional date, which I'm just going to accept it for the purposes of argument here, it was compiled 20 years after Muhammad died, but it tells us little to nothing about the event in question. The Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock was built about 60 years after Muhammad died, but even though this is a fact where later sources say he went, so it says he went here, yet it was built a very long time after he died, and it also contains no reference to the event in question in the original inscriptions, which just sort of make me question whether this mosque was associated with the early account of the night journey, or was that just added on? So that calls into question that. And then we have even later sources. Ibn Ishaq, written about 140 years after Muhammad died, quotes Aisha saying that he was asleep when the event took place. And if you go to that passage, by the way, on the same page, you have later Muhammad affirming this interpretation, but says, yeah, even though I was asleep, but it still really happened in a way, but even though I was asleep in my bed. And then we have Sahih al-Bukhari, which is where modern Muslims get the story, but it was written more than 200 years after Muhammad died, but nevertheless says that Muhammad was the only witness to the event. And I would say probably Ibn Ishaq is probably the best evidence against it because it's direct evidence against it. But putting all this together, I would say that this makes the night journey very unlikely to have occurred. So notice, unlike Richard Dawkins, I actually can show that the night journey did not really happen through evidence, through historical evidence, analyzing it historically, and looking at what happened. So now we're going to look at the resurrection. We're going to look at the evidence of the resurrection and the sources that are used. These include a creed, the epistles of Paul, the Gospels, what they saw and what they tell us, and what critical scholarship can say about them. First, let's look at the Gospels. But before we do that, we need to establish dates here. So we're going to look at a critical scholar, what he says about the dates of the Gospel, Bart Ehrman. He says Mark was probably the first Gospel written around 70 CE or so, Matthew and Luke being a bit later, possibly 80 to 85 CE, and John being the last, around 90 to 95 CE. So these are when the four Gospels date to, according to Bart Ehrman. And already we have it as a lot earlier than the sources for Islam. Even the sources that said it was just a dream come much, much later than the Gospel of John has. And so for Islam, the period of development was many hundreds of years, more than 200 years. And it's only after those 200 years that we see the story that we're now accustomed to. But what about the Gospels? In the Gospel of Mark, we have multiple accounts of Jesus predicting his own resurrection. And even if we accept the shorter ending, it still maintains that the tomb was found empty, which means bodily resurrection, and it says that Jesus had risen from the dead. What about in the Gospel of Matthew? It also says that Jesus predicted his own resurrection, and talks about the empty tomb, and has detailed discussion of his resurrection. In the Gospel of Luke, it says that Jesus predicted his resurrection, and has Jesus appearing to his disciples, and them touching him, proving that it was bodily resurrection. So notice, all the Gospels so far, we have bodily resurrection. And John has a clear passage in which Jesus predicts his resurrection, and we also contains detailed description of his resurrection, and again, confirmation that it was bodily. But these are just the Gospels. Let's go to a much earlier source. So this is a creed in 1 Corinthians 15. Let's read the creed and see what it can tell us. So the parts in red are the parts that were of the original creed, and then the black lines are the parts of Paul. The first part is him establishing that it's a creed, and the last part is him establishing himself as an eyewitness. So it says, the creed says, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he rose again on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas, then by the 12, and after that he was seen by over 500 brethren at once. After that he was seen by James, then by all the apostles. And already we can see a lot of great detail here. First of all, this is the earliest source that we have for the resurrection, and it contains multiple appearances of Jesus. What else can it tell us? Well, it says that Jesus was buried and that he rose again. So, first of all, it says that he rose again, which implies he returned to his previous state, and it also mentions burial. These things make it very clear that it's discussing bodily resurrection, because rising up wouldn't really have a meaning unless you're rising from a grave, and it also says that immediately after the burial. And so it contains bodily resurrection. In addition to that, this is actually the most appearances we have from the Christian account. So the earliest description of the resurrection contains appearance accounts. We can also see at the end of this creed how Paul adds on this little statement, then last of all, he was seen by me also, as one born out of due time. This is very important because it's Paul establishing himself as an eyewitness, so this is significant. But you may ask, how early does this creed date? Well, let's ask some critical scholars, non-Christian scholars. So this is Gerhard Ludermann, who says that the creed falls in the time frame between 30 to 33 CE. This is Robert Funk, who says that the period of development was 2 to 3 years at most. This is Michael Goulder, who says it goes back a couple of years after the crucifixion. And everyone's favorite critical scholar of Christianity, Bart Ehrman, say it just happened 3 years after the event. So we can tell that this is a very early creed that goes back very early. And that's what we can see. But what else do we know about this? Well, here are some statements from scholars. The first two are direct statements, which mention Paul as the author of both 1st and 2nd Corinthians. This is important because we're going to cite these passages later. And here are some quotes from Bart Ehrman, where he assumes Pauline authorships of those two books. So what do those books actually say? Well, we see here in 1 Corinthians, in the same chapter that we cited earlier, we see that Paul puts his faith in the resurrection, how he says it stands and falls with his faith in Christ, stands and falls with the resurrection. That's what he says in 1 Corinthians 15:17. So for him, he claims to be an eyewitness of the resurrection. Then he says, this is where his faith stands and falls. And in the second passage, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he describes the amount of torture, the beatings, he was shipwrecked, he was robbed, he was made in hunger and thirst, all for his belief. He used to be a very, academic, elite man, but when he accepted Christianity, this is what his life was like. So it just shows how he continued to believe it even after this, but there's even more. He was even willing to go to his death for it. This passage from Clement of Rome's Epistle to the Corinthians talks about the martyrdom of both Peter and Paul. And so you can see that Paul wasn't just willing to get beaten and tortured and robbed and gone through hunger and thirst for his belief. He also was willing to go to his death for this belief. And this hasn't just convinced Christians that he really believed that Christ was resurrected and that he really believed that he saw Christ. This is the opinion of other scholars, because let's see what they have to say. So Gerd Luderman says, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus had appeared to them as the risen Christ. Paula Fredrickson says, I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Christ. That's what they say, and that's what all the historical evidence we have afterwards attests to their conviction. That's what they saw. I'm not saying they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw. But I do know as a historian that they must have seen something. So she's very skeptical, but she's still saying that she knows they saw something. The disciples' conviction that they had seen the risen Christ, their reconciliation to Jerusalem, their principal inclusion of Gentiles as Gentiles, all of these are historical bedrocks, facts known past doubting about the earliest community after Jesus' death. And then Bart Ehrman, again, maintains, it is a historical fact that some of Jesus' followers came to believe that he had been raised from the dead soon after his execution. We know some of these believers by name. One of them, the Apostle Paul, quite plainly claims to have seen Jesus alive after his death. So hear what Bart Ehrman is saying here. He's saying that the followers of Jesus believe that they had seen him after his resurrection. And he specifically names Paul as one who claims to have seen Jesus and really believed it. And here we have Anthony Flew, who was a prominent atheist of the 20th century, but who later converted to theism. He said about the resurrection, he says, the evidence for the resurrection is better than for claimed miracles in any other religion. It is outstandingly different in quality and quantity, I think, from the evidence offered for the occurrences of most other supposed miraculous events. This is an important matter of rationality, which I have fairly recently come to appreciate. And so he's saying that the evidence for the resurrection is better than for claimed miracles in any other religion. By the way, this would include the night journey and Islam. So this evidence that we see, I think the best historical explanation for all of these events, for all of these occurrences, is the resurrection. Only if someone can show a reason why we should accept naturalism as true can we disregard this. In other words, this is positive evidence that miracles do occur because of the fact that we have such great testimony and witnesses of a miracle. And so unless you can give me pretty good reason to reject this evidence, it seems that all the evidence points in favor that Jesus really did rise from the dead. So let's look at the conclusion. For Islam, the earliest sources that we have giving us a detailed account of the night journey was written more than 100 years after Muhammad died and maintains that the event happened while Muhammad was sleeping. Only in later sources is the distinction of it being a dream taken away, and where this story that we know today and accustomed to comes from. However, for the resurrection, the earliest sources we have for the resurrection come 1 to 3 years after Jesus died, and maintains bodily resurrection, as well as numerous witnesses. Even non-Christian scholars are convinced that the disciples really believed they had seen the risen Christ, and were willing to go to their deaths because of it. Even one of the most famous atheists of the 20th century says that the resurrection has the best evidence for any miracle in any religion. Based on this, the resurrection, at this point, has the best explanation for what we have of these facts, and is much more plausible than the story of the night journey. And of course, we could have gone into even more detail about this, but I thank you for watching, and God bless.